So we'll move on to the second part of Oman's history. The first part was up to the birth of Sultan Qaboos, the current ruler of Oman. He was born back in 1940 in the southern part of his country, where his father, Said, lived at the time. And Said was really kind of entrenched there. He did not move out of that area except for once in the 1950s, but he really did not move out of that area much at all. Qaboos was educated mostly at home, and then he had some education in Pune, India, but at age 16 he was sent to England, where he finished his education and then entered the Sandhurst Military Academy. Sandhurst is the same as our West Point. It's Great Britain's Army Military Academy, and he completed his education there. And it was sort of fortunate that he did, reasons that you'll see in a minute. But at the end of that, he served actually with a British military unit. He, as a graduate, had a commitment, and he served for a year with a unit in Germany. After that year, he came back to England. He studied issues that related to government, and I've heard stories, I haven't been able to verify this, but I've heard stories that he worked for like a town council, or at least interned. So he took a very, kind of a menial job, a low-level job, working for one of the town or county councils in England. And he did that for about another year, and then he went on a tour around the world to learn a little bit more. He returned to Oman at age 24, and remember, I told you that his father, Said, controlled all the entry and exit visas. Obviously, he was going to let his son back, but Said really was afraid of people who had an education, and as it turned out, he should have been, because Qaboos had received an education, not just a formal education. He had, of course, completed his schooling, and then he had completed his military training as well at Sandhurst. But even more than that, Qaboos, by this time, at age 24, had seen the world. He had worked and lived in Germany. He had worked and lived in England, and he had toured the world. And when he came home, he urged his father, Said bin Tamer, to use the oil money to improve the lives of Omanis and to end Oman's extreme isolation from the rest of the world. And in return for these suggestions, his own father put him under house arrest for 6 years. He virtually could not leave the palace. Qaboos, however, did have contact with some of the British military people who were in the area and who were working with his father. And with their help, he put together a plot to overthrow his father, which happened on July 23rd, 1970, in an almost bloodless coup. The story is that his father got shot in the foot, which was not obviously a fatal injury in any way. His father was sent to exile in London, where he lived for several years before his death. On the very first day that he overthrew his father and seized control of the country, Qaboos announced via radio to the rest of the country that the country, which had been called at that time Muscat and Oman, would now be called Oman. Now, just the name of the country, Muscat and Oman, suggests that it wasn't really a country. There was a very deep and painful divide amongst the people in the country. Qaboos announced that it would be called Oman, and that he would be the sole ruler of Oman, and he would live in Muscat. And this was important because Oman had an imam, which I talked about in the previous lecture, who really, although he's a religious leader, really was ruler of a very, very vast part of Oman, and usurped a lot of power from the Sultan. Or the Sultan had ceded it. It's really, sort of difficult to tell, but Said had really very little interest in ruling the country, and so the Imam had really taken over. Well, Qaboos said, I will be ruler of this country. And he urged the Imam actually to stay. He said, you are welcome to stay. We need you as a religious leader. You are democratically elected. Please stay. The Imam refused. He was angry that his power was being taken away as a ruler, and he went to Saudi Arabia. And more from him in a moment. One of the first things Qaboos had to do was continue the war against a Yemeni insurgency that his father had been fighting for quite some time. The Yemenis were backed by communists, and this is where Qaboos's military training really shows. He truly was a military leader. He truly knew what he was doing. He truly understood how to conduct a military campaign and what to do to help consolidate power once he won those various military campaigns to make sure that the land gained did not slip back. He had a lot of help from the British, who had been involved in Oman for quite some time, not always constructively, in fact, often quite destructively. He also had help from Iranians, and he also had help from Omanis who were returning from Baluchistan. There were a number of Omanis who had fled decades and even centuries before to a part of Iran, part that's now Iran, Pakistan, and that area. And they formed an area, they were Baluchis, and they formed an area called Baluchistan. And they came back now because they saw some sort of hope for their country, and they fought with him against the Yemenis. The main help, however, was from the Iranians and the British. When that war was over, and there's a lot to tell with that, and I know I don't have time. I don't have time to get through all of the slides that I have right now. The Imam, by then, had raised a force to try to overthrow Qaboos, at least in the northern part of the country, in the Jabal Akhtar area, around Nizwa, which is where the Imam had been. And he got an armed force up and tried to overthrow Qaboos. And so Qaboos just turned his forces and the British and the Iranians around and managed to defeat the Imam. Qaboos was and is an absolute monarch. There is absolutely no legislative body of any sort. There is no court that has any limits, that places any limits, no checks upon his power. There is an elected Majlis Shura, which was first elected in 1994, I believe, as an advisory council, but they really have there is no legislative power at all. There's also what they call a committee of state that's appointed. He appoints the people to that. This is very much like the British Parliament, of course, which Qaboos is quite familiar with. The Majlis Shura is very much like the House of Commons, which is an elected body. The Committee of State is very much like the House of Lords, which is an appointed body. Qaboos wrote what is called the White Law, the basic law of Oman, the constitution, if you will. It is the guiding document. But all laws that are made are done by his decree. He decrees that this will happen, that this is a new law, that this person will serve in this post. And several times a week, the newspapers all publish these decrees that he issues. There's no legislative passage of them. He does not sign or veto. He simply issues decrees to what he wants to do. In the years since 1970, when he seized power, Qaboos has accomplished so much. Every single town, every single village has a road that now goes to it, not just a cattle path, not just a camel path, an actual road. Most of them are paved. There are still some in very remote areas that aren't quite paved yet, but that's what these working for. There are a number of multi-lane paved highways that crisscross the country in all except the empty quarter, the desert, where nobody lives. There's no reason to build roads there. Well, there is a reason, and it's because that's where the oil is. So there has to be access to the oil fields, but people don't live there. There are no villages there. Every single village has electricity going to it. Every single village has water, fresh, clean water, and in many cases, it is trucked in. Oman relies a lot on desalinization. They desalinize the seawater, which takes an enormous amount of energy. It's really not sustainable. It takes huge resources to do that, but it's the only way to get enough water for all the villages. And so it's all desalinated, and then it is trucked in these great big blue tanker trucks to the village. Every single village has septic service, to a sewage service that takes the sewage away. There is banking and financial infrastructure, and this is so important. A lot of people overlook this, but Oman has a very vigorous, very solid financial base for businesses. It's the only way that businesses can grow and thrive is if you have some sort of banking infrastructure, not only for loans and for deposits, but to deal with other parts of the world. There is obviously a successful oil business that funds the country. There is free education. If you qualify, you get it all the way through college. If you qualify, you get it through graduate school even. But certainly K through 12 education is free. Healthcare is free. There are embassies and relationships with other countries around the world. And I will say that there are still some very strong human rights problems there, which we can talk about when we get together. You might remember a few years ago there was the Arab Spring uprising in Tunisia, Morocco, in Cairo, in Egypt, and there was in Oman as well in February of 2010. There were protests in Sohar. Sohar is a university town. Sohar University is there. It's about 6,000 students. And the students began to protest. They did not protest to overthrow the government or Sultan Qaboos. They were protesting that there was too much corruption in the government and there were no opportunities for young people there. Qaboos spent many hours, many days working on these problems, and he made changes in his cabinet. He agreed there was corruption. He ousted some ministers, working tirelessly to do this. He created 15,000 jobs. Those also are not ultimately sustainable. And 15,000 jobs is really not that many jobs, but he did that. And he also promised that they would have access to scholarships for education abroad, and we see that at UNO and at UNL. There are about 100 Omani students on each campus, and they're part of that effort. Today, the Sultan is widely respected throughout the Gulf region. Many Gulf leaders come to him when there's a conflict and they ask him to mediate. He has a very good relation with Iran. He's the only Gulf nation that actually talks to Iran and to whom Iran will talk. He has set very much a tone of tolerance in religion, in ethnic matters and things like that. And as I've mentioned, he has been gravely ill over the last couple of years. He spent an entire year in Germany at a property that he owns there getting medical treatments. Nobody really knows for what. We all suspect it's cancer of some sort. However, he made a public appearance just a few days ago to open a new museum there. He'll be 75 years old soon, and is obviously in frail health. And that sort of brings us up to date on Oman's history and what's going on. It's a very brief history. The book tells you much more, but these are highlights of what's going on, and I look forward to being able to talk to you more about the history of Oman when we get together.